I am with Futurity First Insurance Group, and thank you for joining our webinar today on talking about marketing to diverse markets called The New America. I appreciate you guys taking the time on a Thursday afternoon to spend some time with me. And again, thank you for that. So let's get started. All right, so just a little bit of information about myself. I am a managing director at Futurity First. I've been in the business for 25 plus years. Worked with a number of companies, currently worked at Futurity. And really what I wanted to talk about on this slide was just the industry involvement. I love doing things with NAIFA and with Gamma. I've been an avid supporter and member of NAIFA for many, many years. I've had the privilege and the opportunity of working on the NAIFA 2020 task force last couple of years. Certainly work a lot and do a lot of things with the National Diversity Council for NAIFA, which is one of the reasons I'm doing this webinar today. And then just in general, diversity is a very a near and dear topic to my heart for various reasons. One, because I come from a diverse background myself, but secondly, I also feel that understanding and knowing about diversity can help all of us in our business, and we make sure that as we live in a changing world, that we are aware of all the things we should know to deal with the ever-changing face of our country. I speak multiple languages, and I also do a lot of work with nonprofit organizations. So our agenda today is basically going to be talking about the changing face of America. I'd like to talk about the opportunity it offers to all of us, a little bit of insight as to how we penetrate the market, and then I'll finally summarize at the end with some action points in terms of what can you guys take from not just the webinar today, but kind of put things in perspective. So of course, as we know, our country is changing all the time. The changing face of America is a known fact. It has been this way for the last 50 years. The question that all of you have to ask yourself is, are you getting your share of this changing face of America? Let's look at some of the population trends in our country. The US population has had very high population growth in the last 60 years. If you look at 1960, our country had, according to USA Today, about 200 million in population. It had grown significantly by 2007 to 300 million. Currently, it stands at about 325, 330 million. And the projections are that by the time 2050 comes around, which doesn't seem that far anymore, it is going to be 400 million and over. So as you can see, we've had a tremendous amount of growth. Just in 90 years, we would have almost doubled the population. The interesting thing to look here is comparing it to Western Europe and the rest of the world. When you look at the USA population, that is exploding significantly more compared to the Western Europe countries where the population is actually much lesser in growth than our country. So if you look from this slide, a couple of the countries I looked at, if you look at Germany, 12%, if you look at UK, 20% over, if you look at Italy, 22%, and you look at Portugal at 18% from 1960 to 2012, look at the USA. USA has grown by 74%. And a big reason why the USA population is exploding, and you'll see in my future slides as we go along, is primarily due to the multicultural population growth. That has been the single component that has changed the dynamic of population growth, especially for us in the US, going from growing by 74% in just the last 52 years. So if you talk about population trends, and especially for the US, as we talked about in the prior slide, there are three main drivers to growth. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Again, the slide shows you are at 200 million in 60, 300 million in 2007, and then up to 400 million in 2050. So let's talk about the three main drivers. The very first driver is people living longer. You can move to the next slide, please. All right, so longevity is the first factor I'm going to talk about. Then I'll talk about birth rates and then certainly the multicultural markets. It's absolutely a known fact. I'm sure most of you have heard this number the last so many years, especially about baby boomers, that you have 10,000 people a day retiring every day. The healthy age 62 retirees, there's two people in a family, husband and wife, there's a chance that one of them will live to 92. That is a pretty long life, and that's where longevity comes into effect. Someone born today, there's a 30% chance of that person now living to age 100. And here's a fact that's even more interesting, that from all the statistics I've seen, the person that is going to live to age 150 is already alive today. Don't know where, but with all the advances in medical, people living healthier and eating healthier, there are obviously people living longer. And longevity creates a dynamic opportunity of its own, and that's certainly one of the factors that has been a big component of population growth. The next one is the birth rates. In 2007, 4.3 million births, higher than the record set in 1957. So you can see in 57 years or 60 years, the birth record in our country has been significantly higher. And this record growth was the highest in that year in 2007 in the history of the United States from the time that birth rate records have been kept. And I just put in there as a Brady Bunch. Most of you remember this very famous TV show, The Brady Bunch. Imagine how multicultural bunch would look like. Don't know what we would call them. But births are very different than what they were in 1957. The kids that are born today are not all white. Chances are that a newborn baby today is multicultural, as you can see from this slide. And most likely it's either an Asian, a Hispanic, or an African American, or all the other countries and components. But those are the three main population growths that I'm going to focus on: the Asian population, the Hispanic population, and the African American population. And as you can see, the birth rates from what it was in 1957, when it looked like the Brady Bunch, to what it is today, where you've got all different nationalities, all different cultures, all different types of people all over the world that are not just in population growth in our country, but all over the world. So let's talk about websites for a second. So as you know, if you own a business today and you are somebody who's trying to get into a business, you couldn't do without websites. Websites are obviously not optional. So imagine if you were to operate into a business today and somebody said, well, you don't really need a website. You're going to sit back and think, say, are you crazy? How can I not have a website? Because nobody's going to buy from me. And look what happened to these companies that were so familiar back then. Kodak, most of you probably remember, when regular cameras and films were in effect. Borders, Blockbuster Video, and Reader's Digest. And look at how the whole online component has changed the dynamic of these businesses, and many of these businesses are no longer in business. So the question I would ask all of you is, if you own a business today, just like I said, website is not optional. Similarly, diverse market opportunity today is not optional. So same notion, website is not optional, neither is multicultural. So what is the change? That's the question you have to ask yourself. How many of your customers and employees, for those of you that run businesses, are multicultural? And what kind of strategy do you have in place to acquire and retain multicultural customers and employees? This is a question that all of you on the call should be asking yourself. I ask myself this question every day as we hire agents and as we acquire new customers. I have to make sure that all the things that I do in my business are reflective of what our country looks like, making sure that I have enough material or multicultural markets. I have enough knowledge and know-how so I can be fully equipped to deal with and acquire customers from all the different marketplaces. So here's some statistics on those three things we talked about. We talked about longevity earlier. We talked about the birth rates. So let's spend some time talking about multicultural. So the three largest segments that I want to talk about here, certainly there are other markets that are very relative to the growing face of America, but these three are the largest components of the multicultural market. And in the Asian market, I have included all the Asian markets, South Asian being a large component, but then you've got the Chinese, you've got the Koreans, you've got the Japanese, so they're all included for this particular purposes in the Asian American concentration. So you've got Hispanic Americans, you've got Asian Americans, and you've got African Americans. This population is bigger, as you'll see shortly, than many, many countries in the world. So let's talk about minorities and majorities. I know a lot of us have used to using the word minorities. I know myself, coming from a multicultural background, many times I get people to call me a minority, and sometimes I wonder if really I am a minority. Because if you look at the numbers today, 1 out of every 3 people in the United States is multicultural. Let's look at some of the statistics. In 1980, less than 20% of the US population was multicultural. In 1995, about 25.5% of the marketplace was multicultural. And the last one in 2010 is 33.3%. And my gut feeling would be 7 years later, it's probably more in the 40% range. But here's the number that you guys should all think about. By 2040, half of all the Americans will be what we now call a minority. So think about where it came from. 1 out of 5 in 1980, 1 out of 4 in 1995, 1 out of 3 today, and by 2040, it'll be 1 out of 2. So every other American will be considered multicultural. That's a huge shift in the marketplace in terms of multicultural people. So the question to ask is, what's minority anymore? And what's majority? Or is it relative to, doesn't really matter because it depends on what part of the country you are in. So that's something for all of us to think about. So if you looked around the country and if you started looking at the top 10 US cities in the country, these are the cities that are indicated by the thumb tag that are today more multicultural in majority than our actual population. So if you look at San Jose, Los Angeles, San Diego, Phoenix, San Antonio, Houston, Dallas, Chicago, which is where I'm located, Philadelphia, and New York, you don't have to wait till 2040. One top 10 US cities, one out of these two in these top 10 US cities today, in 2017, are majorly multicultural. So let's talk about the business case. On the earlier slide, you saw the population at 117 million. So I wanted to give you guys a breakdown. So if you look at the total US population today, 53 million Hispanics, 45 million African American, and 19 million Asian Americans. And then you can see the median income, because that's a common question that a lot of people ask. Do multicultural people have money? Look at the median income, especially in the Asian American marketplace, $69,095 median household income. But look at the percentage of households earning $100,000 and plus annually. 13% in the Hispanic market, 10% in the African American market, and almost 1/3 of the population in the African and the Asian American space today earns in excess of $100,000. That's a huge opportunity, especially when we think about our business, the business of life insurance, the business of investments, the business of long-term care and disability. We are coming across in the multicultural market a tremendous amount of population that has a lot of money. The question is, how much of this money can you get access to as being agents? So when you think about multicultural markets and you compare that to the US, as I talked about earlier, that the US multicultural people today are bigger than some of the largest countries in the world. If you look at the 117 million of population in the multicultural markets in just the United States, it's larger than Germany, which stands at 81 million, 3 times the size of Canada, that stands at 34 million in population, and larger than the combined populations of New York, Texas, Florida, and California. If you combine those 4 states today, you would be somewhere around 102 million in population. The US multicultural people have an amazing buying power of $2.5 trillion, more than the GDP of 95% of the countries in the world. Just think about that number, $2.5 trillion, and more than 95% of the GDPs of 95% GDP of the countries in the world. That's a huge opportunity for us. So let's think about an experience you might have going to a hospital today. And this is a perspective and a perception on multicultural markets. As you go to a hospital, the first person you come across is a receptionist. That receptionist might happen to be a Hispanic American. Next, you come across a nurse. The nurse may happen to be an African American nurse. Next comes your anesthesiologist if you're going for a procedure. Happens to be a Japanese anesthesiologist. Next, the actual doctor happens to be an Indian doctor. And finally, your specialist and your head doctor happens to be a Korean doctor. So every single one of these people in your experience at a hospital, and I'm sure many of you can relate to this, I know I do, because many times when I take my kids to the hospital, I see this and I wonder that, where am I? Am I in the United States or am I in the world? Can any one of these people be your clients? That's the question you have to ask yourself. Let's look at politics. Of course, we know our last president, Barack Obama, came from an African American background, but look at some of the other leaders in politics and business. These are multicultural people in all walks of life, all the way from congressmen such as Mike Honda, who's in California, to governors, to people in the cabinet, to senators, to Supreme Court justices, to CEOs of companies, big companies like American Express, Pepsi, MasterCard, car companies. All over the world, you've got people, and these are people here in the United States that are all coming from multicultural backgrounds. So people from multicultural backgrounds are in all places in life, in politics and in business leadership. Let's look at our sports arena. Look at some of our sportsmen from Spain, from France, from Serbia, from Taiwan, from Brazil, from Jamaica, from Argentina. And I'm sure most of you on the call recognize a lot of these people because you're avid watchers of sports. You see that a tremendous amount of athletes that are in the teams in our country all come from a multicultural background. Here's an interesting comparison. Let's look at the Yankees team from about 2 years ago. Now, what do you think would happen if this same Yankees team was without diversity? We didn't have the diverse multicultural people that came from other parts of the world. Let's look and see what happens if you didn't have those people. Here you go. You've got a whole bunch of people that are no longer there. You've got 30% of the team left. So that's the significance of when you think about multicultural markets, you have to realize that it has an overlying impact on all facets of life, politics, business, and certainly sports as well. So let's recap a little bit. So nearly 1/3 of the US population, and probably more, about 40% today, is multicultural. They control about 2.5 million in buying power. More than 50% of the population in the 10 largest United States cities, as we discussed earlier today, are multicultural. More than 50 million people in the United States speak a language other than English, and more than 40% of the small businesses in the US are owned by women and minorities. Huge number. Now, when you start talking about multicultural markets or diverse markets or however you want to label it, nowadays you also talk about women's markets. So I wanted to add in a couple of slides here talking about women's market. Women's market controls $7 trillion in the US spending. They account for 85% of overall consumer spending. 66% of employed adults are women. 65% of business owners are women. That was a statistic that really jumped out when I hadn't thought about that. The average American woman is expected to surpass the average American male in earnings by 2028, not far away. Women control more than 60% of all the personal wealth. And finally, women account for 85% of all the consumer purchases, including insurance product. And again, that's a statistic that really stunned me, because most of us, especially those of us that have been in this business for many, many years, have always looked at the insurance industry as a male-dominated industry. But when you look at that statistic by itself, that women account for 85% of all consumer purchases, including insurance products, it tells you who should you be doing business with. And then we also talk about millennials. The millennial market is huge. We all know that. A lot of us have kids who are in that marketplace. 80 million today, 40 million have children. By 2015, which has already happened, their annual spending is about 2.3 trillion. By next year, they will actually eclipse the boomers in the spending power at almost $3.5 trillion. 84% of the millennials are seeking advice about finance. 57% will change financial advisors for technical setting. And again, for those of us that have been in the business for many, many years, myself included, I know that I have to keep up with changing technology, because millennials don't like paper stuff. If you try to send millennials a paper application, they kind of look at you and ask you what planet you live on. But look at this last statistic: 61% want video meetings with advisors. And we always grew up in this industry as a face-to-face distribution. We still are as a face-to-face distribution industry. But 61% of the millennials would rather do business with you through a video conferencing. So certainly, we all have to think about technology and make sure that we're up to par with technology, because that's what the marketplace is calling for. All right, so enough of the statistics. I'm sure by now all of you have enough statistics to understand and agree that our country is changing. Diversity is a big component. Women's marketplace is a big component. Certainly, millennials is a big component of our marketplace. But now let me share some quick strategies and some of the steps that can be taken for you to penetrate multicultural markets. So this is the big one for me personally. I always feel like you have to start with awareness. Numbers are great. Knowing about it is great, but you have to acknowledge and understand that it's not only a nice thing to do, but it's the right thing to do. And I always tell anybody that always asks me about diversity, don't just do it for lip service. Don't just do it because that's what somebody is asking you to do. Do it because you embrace it. So embracing diversity and understanding and trying to learn about different cultures and different communities and different marketplaces is the starting point. So the first step, if any of you are going to work in the diverse space, is to start with awareness. You then create a measurement. You always need a starting point, because a measuring stick and a matrix, and it should be realistic. Anything that cannot be measured is not good. And of course, a big component of success is making sure that you know where you started and where you're trying to go, and be able to measure the success of it, so that as you go along, if changes need to be made, you can make those changes and not wait till the end and then realize that something that you were doing didn't make sense to you. So any strategy that you create to work in a diverse market, you want to make sure you measure it. All right, so this is an interesting scenario. We'll listen to this in a second, but let me just talk to it. So this is when you talk about being culturally attuned, you want to make sure that all the things that you're doing are in that space. So I want to share with you an experience about calling a hospital that happens to be in Brooklyn, New York, that shows how in tune this particular hospital is. So Brendan, if you're able to play it, go ahead.
Для ответа на русском языке нажмите 3. Weiter zu gehen in Yiddish, bitte klick 4. 选择中文，请用1。选择中文，请按5。请限国语。للاستمرار باللغة العربية الرجاء ضغط 6.
Okay, I know it wasn't very clear. I apologize for that. Basically, the idea I wanted to share with you that this is a hospital, and any one of you guys can call this hospital in Brooklyn. Try the main number. These guys are so in tune with multicultural and diverse markets that they decided to put right on upfront on their recording about 9 different languages. I know generally when you call somebody, they talk about Spanish, and in some places they talk about other languages. But this was a hospital, and my assumption is that this hospital, being where it is, probably gets patients from all different communities. So they made sure that they're culturally attuned to focus on all the communities, not just a community or two. And that's why they took the time and the effort to make a recording that had various languages. Now, when you start thinking about developing tools in the multicultural markets, it is very important to think about what you're trying to accomplish. Now, imagine if one of you gets transferred to China, and everything you see there is in language in China. And now you want to do a transaction there, but you don't understand. And then as you're walking around in some street in China, you see a sign that says Happy Thanksgiving in English. How would that make you feel? I assume for most of us that would make us feel very good that somebody in here is actually catering to where I come from and is celebrating a holiday that's important to me. So think about how all those people feel when they come to our country, when they come to the United States, and they just see everything in English and they never see anything in their language, or they don't see any celebration being talked about for their community. How does that make them feel? So think about if your business celebrated holidays for the communities that you serve, and your business had the opportunity of translating a lot of the material in language. Think about how that would make that diverse person feel when he or she read that, heard that. My gut would be that they would be very inclined to do business with you because they would know that you understand and you're in tune with their culture. And then when you talk about branding your business, look at some of the ad prices for some of the publications that are operating in our country. If you were to put an ad, a full-page ad in New York Times today, that would cost you $140,000. If you put it in the Time magazine, it's $340,000. But look at some of the diverse markets newspapers. If you put it in the Indian Express, it's $6,000. If you put it in the World Journal, it's $6,500. So the question to ask is, in our industry here, all the customers pay the same rate. It doesn't matter whether you're Chinese, whether you're African American, whether you're Hispanic, whether you're American, whether you're white, you pay the same rate. Or do they get a discount because they're multicultural? But the cost to reach a multicultural customer is significantly lower. So think about that. If you were trying to reach a multicultural customer, where would you advertise? Would you advertise in New York Times or Time? Or would you advertise in the Indian Express or World Journal, where the reach to the multicultural market is significant and it's significantly cheaper? And then finally, if you run your own company, if you're the CEO, if you're the president, you must lead. You have to get over your internal challenges. Perception, which is the first thing we talked about, you have to embrace diversity. Bigotry, that's a word that's very commonly used in the multicultural markets because, as I said earlier, it's not lip service, it's actually embracing and believing in it. Business as usual, it's not business as usual because it is a different way of doing business. And then a lot of people are fearful of being in the diverse markets. A common question that comes to me is, do I have to speak the language in order to work in the diverse markets? And I always tell people, no, you don't, because a tremendous amount of multicultural markets speaks English. You just need to understand more of the nuances. So this particular slide, my main feedback here is it starts at the top. The company you work for, if you lead the company, your execs need to change the perception. It is very, very important for you in leadership role, again, if you run your company, is to embrace diversity, because if you do, then every other person in your operation will do the same. So as our population is aging, so is our multicultural population aging. The face of America has changed. The question I would ask myself as I started this presentation 30 minutes ago, have you changed your strategy? The question to ask is simply this: what is your strategy? How will you embrace diversity? Every organization should have a strategy. One that doesn't is called a bad strategy. And finally, what percentage of your customers or employees is multicultural? And what is your plan to grow in diverse markets? And that really is what I wanted to talk about on this presentation, that if you truly believe in diversity, if you truly believe in embracing diversity, then you need to have some kind of a plan in place that should gather around understanding diversity, having a plan to address that, and then continually embracing it and following through with whatever plan you have designed to embrace diversity. And with that, I know I finish up in 35 minutes, so those are a few that are questions. I'm sure Brendan will open that up, but I appreciate. And certainly, if any of you would like further clarification, feedback, talk to me about diversity, have ideas, I'm always willing to learn from all of you, because this is not just me, it's myself and our industry, and certainly NAFA is there to help us understand the diverse markets, and hoping that between NAFA, myself, and all of you, we can truly understand and embrace the changing face of America.
Thank you, Amir. And we have left some time for your questions. And as a reminder, you can type your questions in the question box on the right side of your screen. And while we're pausing a moment for the questions to come in, Amir, you talk about the experience of someone who is a minority, and you gave the great example of the Thanksgiving sign being written in English if I were visiting China, for example. So clearly, a level of cultural sensitivity goes a long way in terms of outreach, in terms of multicultural marketing. But even going beyond that, for example, hiring someone who speaks a language that you don't speak, what are some of the considerations that you'd want to have around that hiring decision? Is that always a wise idea, or even a necessary idea?
So I think that is a great point that, like in my organization here, Brendan, we have literally a United Nations, because I understand being in Chicago, we have a melting pot of people, and I call it a salad bowl now. And we have people from all different communities, and to be able to market insurance and financial products in all these different communities, a lot of times language dependency comes in. So even though a tremendous amount of multicultural people come to the country and they can speak English, they still like to hear people who sound like them or talk like them, and it's very helpful. So right to your point, I think it's a great opportunity to have staff and to have, people in your operation who speak different languages. It's certainly very helpful.
Excellent. And we do have our first question. What was step number 2 on Amir's 6 steps? And so we're going to go ahead and we're going to find out what question 2 was. I'm sorry, I'm going backwards on the slides here. So let's go ahead and find question number 2. Excuse me, step number 2.
Yeah, step number 2 was basically you want to create a measurement. So you want a starting point so that you can measure it, because a lot of times what I've seen in my experience is that people will start to venture into diversity by either engage into a diverse market or hiring somebody from a diverse market or trying to do a program into diverse markets, and they don't measure the success. And then, they do it once, they do it twice. An example might be, let's say you decide to do some work into a Chinese American market, and you feel like that's a language dependent market, and the first thing I should do is hire a Chinese agent that speaks the language because that gives me an inroad. And for some reason that Chinese agent doesn't work out, you feel like, oh, that's a bad market to be a part of. We all do that. And then you just don't do it anymore. So it's very, very important to have a starting point and a measurement stick, because it takes time. Diverse markets can be tricky, especially the ones that are language dependent. You need to give it a considerable amount of time and create a measuring stick and say, okay, I'm going to give it 6 months. I'm going to give it 12 months. The first Chinese agent didn't work out in that example, I'm going to hire a second one. Or the first staff person didn't work out, I'm going to hire a second staff person and see that that works. That's what I meant there.
And is there any difference in terms of the frequency of referrals in general, or is it not possible to generalize when you're dealing with a certain multicultural market? Do referrals tend to be accelerated in that circumstance?
Yeah, so I think multicultural market referrals are definitely faster because it's a relationship-based market, not that mainstream market is not. But generally speaking, when you come across somebody from multicultural markets, and especially from your own marketplace, I tend to find, my experience, 27 years, that referrals come much faster, because if they've already trusted you and decided to do business with you and found you as one of the few that either speak the language or come from their marketplace, then they feel like they want to help their other friends as well.
And in your business, Amir, what type of service do you provide? Life insurance and wealth management? Anything else beyond that?
Yeah, so we are a full service firm. We do everything: long-term care, disability, Medicare products. So it gives us a good opportunity to help people in all different areas of the business. And especially there are communities in the multicultural markets where some of the people who come from overseas are not used to certain products. Like Medicare is a word that's very unknown to a lot of people that come from other parts of the world. Medicare is obviously very prominent here in the U.S., but you'll be amazed how many countries have no concept of Medicare, have no concept of health insurance.
So with these markets, your role can be as much of a guide and educator, just in terms of American financial culture and government programs as well.
That's correct. In fact, a lot of times it's exactly that. And then if you do a good job with that, then people start trusting you. And when people start trusting you, then the sale itself becomes important. One of the things, I didn't have it in my slides, but I'll tell you based on my experience, that product selling doesn't go very well in multicultural markets. Consultative sales goes better. Multicultural people, when they start thinking that it's a salesperson who is there to sell, generally don't do business with people as much as if they're thinking it's somebody there to help them. And if, as a result of asking for help and helping with what they need, if a product sale needs to happen, then so be it. So it's just a different way of looking at things. If somebody calls me, my gut is not that I'm going out there to make a sale, even though at the back of my mind, obviously that's what I am, because we only get paid when we sell. But it's just a lot of psychological that you have to make the client understand that you're there to help them become financially secure. And obviously, sales is secondary.
So some of this is long-term business development also.
Correct.
Excellent. Well, that is all the questions that we have, and I want to thank our presenter, Amir Chalisa, so much for sharing his ideas on multicultural marketing and its importance. And I also want to thank our attendees today, our participants on the webinar, for taking time out of your day to participate in this third and final installment in the NAIFA Diversity Webinar Series. This webinar recording will be emailed to you automatically so that you can go ahead and view the recording, including Amir's 6 easy steps to multicultural market penetration. This concludes the NAIFA webinar.
Thank you.